But of course, that's slightly at odds with another promise, as it were, held out by linguistic philosophy, and it's this. The logical positivists kept philosophy tied to science's apron strings in the way that you described a moment ago. But as you explained, the linguistic philosophers were prepared to look at anything and everything.
Yeah.
And one consequence of that was that philosophical techniques were thought of as being techniques that could be applied to literally every field of human discourse that there is. There's no reason why you shouldn't, on these assumptions, have a philosophy of medicine, a philosophy of economics, a philosophy of population theory, a philosophy of sport, a philosophy of anything. Because in any field, let's take medicine, for example, you could take some of the characteristic and central concepts. In medicine it would be, shall we say, health, disease, cure, all of which are in fact deeply problematic concepts once you start seriously considering them. And you could, as it were, give them the treatment. You could turn the blowtorch, as it were. You could use these philosophical techniques of analysis on them, thereby clarifying all discourse in that particular field. Now, the very fact that this was thought to be applicable to all fields of human discourse seems to present you with an endless task if you're thinking in terms of exhaustive analysis.
Yes, that's why I think one wouldn't want to say that anyone ever thought that all the concepts could be clarified. What they thought was that the problems could be, the major problems could be dissolved. And that's because there was a view about where the major problems came from. Of course, there are philosophical, conceptual questions to be answered about medicine. And there are. People now are equally interested in, perhaps even more interested in these same issues you just referred to about health and so on. Interesting application, of course, that is in the case of mental health, where the very concept of mental illness has been found problematical by some people, and philosophical inquiry has gone on that basis. But no, to go back to the preoccupations of linguistic philosophy, the central problems, I think, were found to arise in two sorts of ways. First of all, with enormously general concepts. Not concepts as specific as health, but ones that arise all over the place, like the notion of something being the same as something else, or the notion of something causing something else, or just the notion of something changing, the concepts of time and space and so on. These are notions which we use in all fields of discourse, and their very general character gave rise to, as indeed it traditionally has given rise to, a central corpus of philosophical problems to try and understand these notions. A second important area was perceived, and I think rightly perceived, to arise on the borderline between two different kinds of discourse. For instance, on the borderline between talking about the physical things and talking about psychological things. And the book by Ryle, to which you referred, The Concept of Mind, was specifically an attempt to apply the sorts of techniques that linguistic analysis used to questions like, how do we know that other people have experiences? What is it for a living, solid thing to have thoughts? And questions of that kind. Now, indeed, these were not new problems. Put in that form, they are very old problems of philosophy. The whole point was that if you took that area where the problems were very pressing and used these techniques, the problems wouldn't look the same as they did before. They would dissolve into a series of separate conceptual issues that we might be able to handle.
Apart from this promise of solution to all problems, which is obviously extremely attractive, what was the special appeal of linguistic philosophy to so many very clever people? Because it did seem to have a sort of spellbinding appeal for many people. People caught it almost like a disease.
I think there were less deep and more deep reasons for that. I think that one of the deeper ones was that it presented, in almost all its forms, it presented some contrast or other between the depth and seriousness of the motivation and the everydayness of the style. The examples were very everyday. There was a rather deliberate attempt to avoid portentous philosophical technical terminology of any kind. It didn't sound high-flown. There was a possibly rather downbeat style. And because one felt at the same time that actually, though it didn't necessarily look like it, one was doing something rather serious, that provided a particular kind of what might be called Socratic pleasure. It had, as it were, the everyday, rather dry, ironical aspect of the material, serving what, as it were, we all knew, was a deeper purpose. Now, that came out rather differently in the Wittgenstein style, to which you referred, and in the Oxfordian style, which was rather more deliberately dry. There's a remark of Austin's, which was rather famous at the time, when he would give one of these seminars and he would be concerned with what, I mean, portentously would have called problems about free will and responsibility and so on, but actually he would never say that. What he was doing, he was discussing the difference between doing something inadvertently or by mistake or accidentally and so forth. And at some point, some visitor would say, Professor Austin, what great problems of philosophy are illuminated by these inquiries, to which Austin would say, roughly all of them.
Yes.
And this somehow struck the note. I mean,
Yes.
as you can see in the...
Yes. I think a lot of people were misled by the triviality of the examples. I mean, mind you, this has gone on throughout the history of philosophy. I mean, in an earlier generation, there was a well-known moral philosopher who wrote chapter after chapter about the problems raised by whether or not you ought to give a book back once you'd borrowed it, and what kind of an ought that was, and how...
Well, only one chapter, to be fair.
Well, one chapter, yes. But, I mean, that was the subject of many jokes. But, of course, the point there was that this was not a man agonising over whether or not to return a book, but considering the whole nature of moral obligation and so on. Now, in the case of linguistic philosophy, I think this was also true, wasn't it? Although linguistic philosophers, as you say, deliberately adopted a rather deflationary style and deliberately employed trivial-seeming examples, there was a serious reason for employing trivial examples, namely they wanted nothing in what they were saying to hinge on the particular example.
That's right, and they realised that, I think part of the idea was that if you took some immediately obvious, grand or dramatic or apparently profound example, then you were faced with two alternatives. Either it really was profound, in which case it was almost certainly too complex and hard to start with. We ought to have got there by taking some more everyday concern first, or else it wasn't and it was just bogus. I mean, it was part of, as it were, the traditional rhetoric of philosophy, and of course part of the charm of doing the subject this way was that it deflated, it exposed much of the traditional rhetoric of philosophy. I think myself that there was a deep concern behind the choice of the simple examples, the downbeat style, though, to be fair, it was probably rather more urgently felt in the Wittgensteinian styles than it was in some of the Oxfordian styles, where I think some of it really was just done because it was fun, and so on. Though I think one has to say, this isn't our major point, I think, at the moment, but I myself want to say that I think this was a much sounder enterprise when people were talking about perception or the theory of knowledge. I think you really should be able to talk about that in a very everyday context, or again, when one was talking about certain problems in the theory of meaning, than it was when one was talking about ethics or politics. And it's not uncharacteristic that, in fact, political philosophy never prospered under this regime at all. It's just not a subject that ever took to it. And I think that's connected with this fact. I mean, it's because the categories of the dramatic and the serious are themselves political and moral categories.
Yes.
And that's not true about seeing and knowing and counting and these other concepts.
I suppose another aspect of the appeal of linguistic philosophy to clever people was the inculcation of a very salutary self-consciousness about the use of language. I mean, almost the inculcation of a new kind of responsibility, the insistence that it really does matter that you express yourself scrupulously clearly.
Yes, I think this is extremely important, what the nature of this self-awareness was. And it's interesting that though some people have criticised linguistic philosophy for being pedantic or just lexicographical or trivial in these respects, or worrying too much about small points of verbal formulation, in fact, it's the same demand that has been made often by poets, for instance, by Auden in much of his work, and by very self-conscious writers, in particular, odd enough, by Yeats, who felt that somehow the integrity of meaning, the fact that you should say no more and less than what you mean, or that you should be self-aware about what that is itself a bulwark against, as it were, dissolution, terror, splurge.
Karl Kraus, George Orwell, there's almost a literature articulating that point of view.
The feeling of the resistance of the pollution of the speech And that the resistance that they wouldn't have been put in the downbeat tone that was then prevailing. Certainly at the Oxford end of the proceedings, it would rather more in the Wittgensteinian end. We have to remember that Wittgenstein came from Vienna, where this had for a long time been a very deeply felt concern. At the Oxford end, it wouldn't have been put like that. That would itself sounded rather high-flown. But in fact, that was undoubtedly part of the motivation, and in my view, an important one.